Christmas dinners in my family were never about comfort. They were performances. The table was always long, polished until it reflected the chandelier like a mirror, every place setting aligned as if measured with a ruler. The house smelled of roasted meat and pine, expensive candles burning down to nothing just to prove they could be replaced. From the outside, it looked warm. Inside, it was a stage, and everyone knew their role. That night, I already knew where I stood. Not at the center. Never at the center. I took my seat near the end of the table, close enough to be seen, far enough to be forgotten. My brother sat opposite my father, exactly where he belonged, shoulders relaxed, voice already carrying before he spoke. He had that confidence people get when they've been applauded their whole lives. Halfway through dinner, while wine was being poured and laughter floated easily between courses, he leaned back in his chair and smiled at me, not kindly, not cruelly either, confidently, like stating a fact no one would question. "Working so hard yet still poor," he said. "That's always been your thing." The words landed lightly, almost playful, but the table reacted instantly. My father laughed, a short approving sound like punctuation at the end of a sentence. Someone else smiled. A cousin looked down at her plate, embarrassed, but silent. No one disagreed. No one corrected him. I felt it then, that familiar tightening in my chest. Not shock, not even anger, recognition. This was how they saw me. This was the story they told themselves so they could sleep at night. I smiled, calmly, politely, the kind of smile that looks like acceptance. They thought the story was finished. They had no idea it was only beginning. The conversation moved on as if nothing had happened. My brother started talking about work, about numbers that impressed my father, about deals that made my mother's eyes shine with pride. The room warmed around him, around his success. I cut my food slowly, listening, nodding when expected, invisible again. That's how it always worked. The insult didn't need defending because it didn't feel like an attack to them. It felt like order being maintained, like gravity. Some people rose. Some people stayed where they were placed. I watched them from my seat and realized something I had never fully named before. This wasn't just teasing. It wasn't even disappointment. It was agreement. Agreement that I belonged where I was, and that nothing I did would move me out of that space. My brother spoke with the ease of someone who had never doubted his trajectory. My father echoed him, reinforcing every word with the weight of approval. My mother adjusted napkins, poured wine, smoothed over pauses. She never contradicted him. She never needed to. I stayed quiet. Not because I didn't have anything to say, because I had learned a long time ago that speaking only gave them something to push against. Silence, at least, kept my footing hidden. At some point, my brother glanced at me again, almost curious. "You should really think about something more stable," he said, as if offering advice. "You don't want to wake up one day and realize you've got nothing to show for all that effort." My father nodded. "Security matters," he added. "Some people never figure that out." I met his eyes briefly and looked away. There it was again. The verdict delivered gently like a favor. They thought I was quiet because I had nothing to defend. They didn't realize I was quiet because I had everything to lose by speaking too soon. Dinner continued. Plates were cleared. Dessert arrived. The rhythm of the evening smoothed itself back into something almost pleasant. If anyone had walked in then, they would have seen a perfect family celebrating the holidays together. They would never have guessed how cleanly a person could be erased while still sitting at the table. As I listened to them talk, I felt something settle inside me. Not pain, not resignation, clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding I needed to fix. It wasn't a phase I needed to outgrow. It was a structure, a hierarchy they had built years ago and never questioned. My brother at the top, my father reinforcing it, everyone else orbiting in approval or silence. And me, the example, the cautionary tale, the one they could point to and say, "See, this is what happens when you choose wrong." I let them believe it. I had been letting them believe it for years. When dinner finally wound down and chairs scraped softly against the floor, my brother stood tall, confident, satisfied. He had performed well. The room had agreed with him. The world, as far as he could see, was exactly as it should be. I gathered my things quietly, thanked my mother, nodded to my father. No one stopped me. No one asked if I was okay. They never did. As I stepped away from the table, I understood something with absolute certainty. They thought this dinner had confirmed everything they already believed about me. They thought the story was settled. What they didn't know was that this table, this room, this moment, would one day feel very different to them. And when it did, they wouldn't be laughing. For now, I let them enjoy their certainty. I carried my silence with me, steady and intact, knowing exactly how dangerous it could be when no one sees it coming. The conversation flowed on without me, smooth and practiced, like a river that had long ago carved its path. Laughter rose and fell at the right moments. Glasses clinked. My brother's stories landed exactly where they were meant to, each one reinforcing the same quiet conclusion. I existed at the table, but not in the room. That was when it hit me with a clarity I couldn't ignore anymore. This wasn't about a bad joke or a careless comment. It was about agreement. Everyone there, whether they spoke or stayed silent, accepted the same version of me. The version that worked hard and got nowhere. The version that tried and failed. The version that proved over and over why the family had chosen the right child to believe in. Families like mine don't announce their rules. They don't need to. You learn them by watching who gets praised and who gets tolerated. Success in our house came with a very specific shape. It looked like money you could point to, titles you could introduce at parties, houses you could drive past slowly. Anything else was a detour. Anything else was indulgence. My brother fit that shape perfectly. He always had. From the time we were kids, he moved through the world like it was designed to meet him halfway. Teachers loved him. Coaches praised him. My father spoke about him with a pride that filled entire rooms. Even when he failed, it was framed as potential. Even when he struggled, it was temporary. I learned early that I didn't get the same generosity. When I did well, it was interesting. When I struggled, it was evidence. Evidence that I needed guidance, correction, redirection. My achievements were curiosities. His were milestones. There was a moment years ago when I finally understood the difference. I had come home excited about something I'd built, something that felt new and promising. I remember standing in the doorway, heart racing, waiting for approval I hadn't yet learned not to expect. My father listened politely, nodded once, and then asked my brother how his day had been. Just like that, the moment passed. Not rejected, replaced. After that, I stopped trying to compete for space that had never been mine. Back at the table, I watched my mother smile as my brother spoke. She was good at that smile, soft, supportive, the kind that smoothed over sharp edges without ever challenging them. She wasn't cruel, she just believed in peace more than fairness. And peace in our family meant not disturbing the hierarchy. People think silence means acceptance. They're wrong. Silence is often the result of calculation. I had learned that explaining myself only invited correction. Defending my choices only gave them more opportunities to diagnose my flaws. So I stopped. Over time, my quiet became part of the story they told about me. I was unsure. I was still figuring things out. I was behind. It made them comfortable to believe that. It gave my brother a clearer contrast, a reason to shine brighter. Even now, years later, the words still stung when they landed. Not because I believed them, but because they echoed so many others that came before. Working so hard yet still poor. As if effort without visible reward was a personal failure. As if there were only one acceptable outcome for a life well lived. I excused myself early that night, slipping away while the room was still warm with conversation. Outside, the air was cold and sharp, and I breathed it in deeply. Away from the table, away from their certainty, my thoughts finally had room to move. They believed I was still searching for my place. They believed I hadn't found my footing. What they didn't see was how carefully I had chosen to stand where I was. What they didn't understand was that staying underestimated gave me something they could never take from me: time. I had learned to edit myself around them, short updates, vague answers, no details that could be dissected or dismissed. I let them fill in the gaps with their assumptions. It was easier that way. Safer. There were nights when I wondered what would happen if I told them the truth, if I laid everything out plainly and forced them to see me differently. But I knew how that story would end. They would reshape it, claim it, fold it into the family narrative until it no longer belonged to me. Success, once acknowledged, would become communal, conditional, controlled. So I kept my distance. Not physically, but strategically. I showed up just enough to remain familiar, just enough to stay small in their eyes. The hardest part wasn't the insults. It was the pity that followed them, the careful suggestions, the looks that said, "It's okay, not everyone wins." That kind of concern is far more dangerous than mockery. It justifies interference. It gives people permission to decide what's best for you. As I drove away that night, the house glowing behind me like a postcard, I realized something else. They didn't see my silence as restraint. They saw it as confirmation, proof that they were right all along. They thought the script had been written years ago and that I was still following it, line by line. They believed I had accepted my role. What they didn't know was that I had stopped reading their script entirely. I had learned how to write my own, quietly, deliberately, far from their applause. And that decision, more than any argument or explanation, was the one that changed everything. Every time my family spoke about my future as if it were already decided, my mind went back to one specific day. Not the jokes, not the dinners, not even the laughter. The day everything truly broke was the day I stopped pretending I could belong to them and still be myself. It was years earlier, long before that Christmas dinner, back when I still believed honesty might earn me a seat at the table instead of a label. I remember the air in the house that evening, heavy and formal, as if the walls themselves were bracing for impact. My parents had asked us both to come for dinner, just the four of us. No cousins, no distractions. That alone should have warned me. We sat in the dining room, the same one they used for holidays and celebrations, even though there was nothing to celebrate that night. My brother sat comfortably, confident as always. He already knew his place was secure. I sat straighter than usual, hands folded, heart pounding, rehearsing my words in my head like they were lines in a play I was desperate to perform correctly. When there was a pause in the conversation, I spoke. I told them I wasn't going to follow the path they had laid out for me. I said it calmly. I said it clearly. I explained that I had my own plans, that I was building something different, something I believed in. I didn't ask for permission. I asked for understanding. The silence that followed was immediate and sharp. My father was the first to react. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His disappointment filled the room like smoke. He asked me if I understood how irresponsible I sounded. He reminded me of everything they had invested, everything they had planned. He spoke about reputation, about stability, about how choices reflect on a family, not just an individual. My mother reached for my hand, her touch light, almost apologetic. She told me she just wanted me to be safe. She said dreams were fine, but reality was unforgiving. She said I was smart enough to know better. My brother leaned back in his chair and smiled, not unkindly, amused, as if he were watching someone make a predictable mistake. He joked that some people needed to learn things the hard way. He said it would be good for me to get it out of my system. That was when I realized this wasn't a conversation. It was a correction. My father's tone shifted then, from disappointment to authority. He laid out the conditions plainly. Support, he said, came with expectations, education, financial help, connections. All of it depended on alignment. If I chose to walk away from what they had prepared for me, I would be walking away from them as well. There it was. The truth they had never said out loud before. Love, in our family, was conditional. I I felt fear rise in my chest. Not the dramatic kind, not panic. The cold, practical fear of someone realizing the ground beneath them is about to disappear. I thought about rent, about bills, about how much easier it would be to nod and agree and make everyone comfortable again. But underneath that fear was something stronger. Clarity. If I stayed, I would never own my life. Every success would belong to them. Every failure would be proof they were right. I would always be managed, corrected, shaped into something acceptable. So I said no. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I simply told them I understood the consequences and that I was still making my choice. The room changed instantly. My mother's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. My father's jaw tightened, anger replacing disappointment. My brother's smile faded into something harder, something like irritation that I hadn't played my part properly. By the end of the night, the decision was final. There were no dramatic ultimatums shouted across the table, just facts delivered with the cold efficiency of a contract being terminated. No more financial support, no safety net, no expectations of help if things went wrong. I left that house with less than I arrived with, but also with something I hadn't had before: ownership. The days that followed were quiet and brutal. I packed what little I had: clothes that fit into 2 suitcases, a few personal items I couldn't bring myself to leave behind. Nothing sentimental from the house. I didn't want reminders of a place where I had never been fully welcome. No one stopped me. No one asked me to stay. They assumed I would fail. They assumed I would struggle, get scared, come back humbled and grateful for another chance. In their minds, my leaving was temporary, a lesson I would learn from. What they never considered was that I might succeed without them. Years later, sitting at that Christmas table, listening to my brother laugh about how I would always be broke, I could see how deeply that assumption had settled into them. My absence had become evidence. My silence had become confirmation. They believed walking away had been my downfall. They were wrong. Walking away had been the moment I became unreachable. The first thing I learned after leaving was how loud silence can be. No calls from my parents, no check-ins, no warnings, just space. Total, indifferent space that forced me to listen to my own thoughts without interruption. For the first time in my life, there was no one watching, correcting, or waiting to say I told you so. I didn't have a safety net, no family money, no connections to lean on, no one to call if something went wrong. Every decision carried weight, because there was no one else to absorb the consequences. Strangely, that fear didn't paralyze me. It sharpened me. I moved carefully, quietly. I didn't announce what I was doing or where I was going. I didn't post updates or ask for opinions. I understood instinctively that attention was dangerous. Attention invited questions. Questions invited interference. And interference was the one thing I could not afford. So I disappeared in plain sight. I worked from small spaces that never looked impressive. I kept my life simple, almost sparse, by necessity at first and then by design. Long days blurred into longer nights. There was no applause, no reassurance, no one telling me I was on the right track, just progress measured in small, stubborn increments. What I was building didn't matter to anyone else yet, and that was exactly the point. I learned to trust patterns instead of praise, data instead of approval, results instead of recognition. The work was demanding in a way my family had never seen. Not the kind you can boast about at dinner parties, the kind that requires discipline when no one is watching, and resilience when no one cares. Sometimes, late at night, doubt crept in, the kind that whispers when exhaustion lowers your defenses. Was this what my father had meant? Was I confusing independence with stubbornness? Those moments were brief, but they were real. I didn't fight them. I acknowledged them and kept going. What I never did was look back. I stayed in light contact with my family, just enough to remain present in their lives without giving them access. Short messages, polite updates, vague answers. If they asked how things were going, I said I was busy. If they asked about work, I said I was managing. I never lied outright. I simply let them assume what they wanted to assume. They filled in the gaps quickly. To them, I was struggling. To them, I was scraping by. To them, my silence meant there was nothing worth mentioning. Underestimation is a powerful shield. As my work began to gain traction, I resisted the urge to correct the narrative. The temptation was there, especially during family gatherings. When my brother spoke confidently about his success, and someone glanced at me with polite concern, I felt the truth pressing against my ribs, begging to be released. I held it back. I knew exactly what would happen if I didn't. They would want details, then control, then opinions. They would reframe my success as something that needed guidance, management, protection. They would make it communal, conditional, diluted. This was mine. I wasn't giving it away. The first real breakthrough came quietly. No announcement, no celebration. Just confirmation that the foundation I had been laying was solid. I stared at the numbers longer than I needed to, not because they were impressive, but because they were undeniable. Proof that I wasn't chasing a fantasy. Proof that I hadn't been wrong to walk away. I didn't tell anyone. Instead, I reinvested everything: time, money, focus. I kept my life outwardly unchanged, even as the stakes grew heavier beneath the surface. Two versions of me existed at once. The one my family saw, still behind, still figuring things out. And the one no one saw, making decisions that carried real weight. Living like that came at a cost. There were moments I wanted to share the wins, small as they were. Moments I wanted someone to understand how hard I was pushing, how much pressure I was carrying. But I had learned something important. The wrong kind of understanding can be more dangerous than none at all. So I stayed quiet, not out of fear, out of strategy. As time passed, I felt the distance between perception and reality widen. My family's version of me grew smaller and flatter, while my real life expanded in ways they couldn't imagine. That gap became my advantage. Still, I wasn't naive. I knew silence couldn't last forever. Growth attracts attention. Success leaves a trail, no matter how carefully you move. I could feel it approaching, like weather changing in the distance. The air thickened with it. I also began to notice something else: threads connecting my world to my brother's. Faint but unmistakable. Names overlapping, institutions intersecting. Decisions made in rooms I'd never set foot in, yet somehow touched what I was building. I didn't react. I didn't interfere. I simply observed. Power, I was learning, doesn't rush. It waits. By the time I lay down at night, exhausted but clear-headed, I understood the truth of what I had done. I hadn't hidden because I was ashamed of my life. I had hidden because I was preparing it. And the longer they laughed, the safer I became. They believed I was falling behind, when in reality I was positioning myself somewhere they would never see coming. I went back to my family again a few months later, not because I wanted to, but because disappearing entirely would have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer. It wasn't Christmas this time, just a casual gathering framed as lunch, the kind of event designed to feel harmless. Those were always the most dangerous. The house looked the same, polished, calm, comfortable in its certainty. Walking through the door felt like stepping into a role I had never auditioned for but was expected to perform flawlessly. No one greeted me with hostility. No one needed to. The smiles were enough. Conversation drifted easily at first. Safe topics, work, travel. Someone mentioned a new house my brother was considering. My father listened with that familiar approval, nodding as if each word confirmed something deeply personal to him. I sat on the edge of the group, coffee cooling in my hands, waiting for the shift. It came quietly. "So," my aunt said, her tone light, almost affectionate. "Are you still doing your thing?" My thing. The phrase landed softly, but it carried weight. It reduced years of effort into something temporary, almost whimsical. A phase. "I'm working," I said, neutral, non-committal. She smiled in that sympathetic way people use when they've already decided you're behind. "That's good, as long as you're keeping busy." My brother glanced over, just long enough to register me, then returned to his conversation. The message was clear. I wasn't worth interrupting success for. As lunch went on, the comments shifted. They always did, from jokes to concern, from concern to advice. Advice I hadn't asked for. You know, my father said, not looking at me directly, stability becomes more important as you get older. I nodded. Silence was easier than explaining that stability meant something very different to me than it did to him. My mother joined in, her voice gentle but firm. We just worry about you. It's hard watching you struggle when you don't have to. Struggle. That word again. It was fascinating how confidently they used it, how little evidence they needed. They saw what they wanted to see, and my quiet made it convenient. What hurt wasn't the assumption. It was the pity behind it. Pity strips you of agency. It turns your life into a problem that needs solving, preferably by someone more qualified. I smiled, thanked them for their concern. Let the conversation move on. Inside, something tightened. On the drive home, the silence in my car felt heavier than usual. I replayed the afternoon in my mind, not because I was hurt, but because I was calculating. Each comment had pushed a little further than the last. Each assumption had grown bolder. My restraint was being mistaken for weakness. That night, alone in my apartment, I finally let myself feel it. Not sadness, frustration. The kind that creeps in when you're exhausted and emotionally overextended. I sat at my desk, staring at a screen full of numbers that told a very different story than the one my family believed. I was carrying more responsibility than they could imagine, making decisions that affected people they would never meet, balancing risks that could collapse everything if I misstepped. And yet, at their table, I was still the one who needed guidance. Silence protected my work, but it took a toll. A few weeks later, I felt the first real crack in my carefully maintained anonymity. I was at a coffee shop, waiting for my order, half listening to the hum of conversation around me, when someone behind me said my name. Not casually, questioningly. I turned, heart rate spiking before I could stop it. He looked familiar in that vague, professional way. Someone from an event. Someone who had seen my work, even if he didn't know me personally. Sorry, he said, smiling. You look just like someone I saw mentioned in an article. Must be a coincidence. I laughed it off, played it down, watched his curiosity fade as he shrugged and stepped aside. But my hands were shaking when I picked up my cup. That was when it truly hit me. Silence wasn't just an emotional burden anymore. It was a risk. The larger things grew, the harder it would be to stay invisible. The story my family told about me couldn't coexist forever with the reality I was building. Still, I didn't break. Revealing the truth now would have handed control back to them. They would have rushed in with praise and concern and offers to help. They would have reframed my success as something they had always supported, something that belonged to all of us. They would have rewritten the past to make themselves comfortable. I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Truth, I had learned, loses power when it's used defensively. When you reveal it to stop an attack, it becomes negotiable, questioned, diminished. I wanted mine to be final. As my work accelerated, so did the pressure. Meetings became more serious. Expectations rose. I could feel the walls closing in, the distance between my two worlds shrinking whether I liked it or not. Each success pulled me closer to exposure. And yet, every time my family laughed, every time they spoke about me as if I were still stuck in the same place, it strengthened my resolve. They were building a version of me that would collapse under the weight of the truth when it finally arrived. By the end of that season, I understood something I hadn't before. Staying silent was no longer just painful, it was dangerous. The same silence that had protected me was starting to strain under the pressure of everything it held. Something was coming. I didn't know exactly how or when, but I could feel it in the way conversations shifted, in the way my phone buzzed more often, in the way my family grew more confident in their conclusions. Silence had bought me time. Soon, it would demand payment. The shift didn't announce itself with drama. It came quietly, Buried in an email I almost missed, the subject line neutral enough to look routine. I opened it expecting another minor update, and felt the room tilt instead. Something fundamental had changed. Up until then, the pressure had been personal, emotional, manageable. I could absorb family comments and keep moving. This was different. This was structural, the kind of problem that didn't care how calm I was or how carefully I'd planned. It threatened everything I had built, not just my pride. The issue spread fast once I started pulling at the thread. A partner hesitating, a deal stalled mid-process. Questions that shouldn't have been questions suddenly needing answers. Each one pointed to the same conclusion. If this collapsed, it wouldn't be quiet. It would be public, messy, and final. For the first time in a long while, fear sharpened into something physical. Not panic, focus. The kind that makes your vision narrow and your thoughts precise. I closed the door, shut out the noise of the city, and started working through the problem piece by piece. There was no one to call for reassurance, no parent to cushion the fall, no safety net hidden behind polite smiles. My brother, in his world, could have made one call and shifted the weight onto someone else's shoulders. I didn't have that luxury. I was alone with the consequences of my own decisions. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was the moment my family always assumed would come. The inevitable failure. The proof that they had been right to worry, right to doubt, right to keep their distance. If they had known how close I was to losing everything, they would have nodded knowingly and called it fate. I didn't give it to them. I took stock of what I could control and what I couldn't. I limited exposure, tightened communication, asked the right questions without revealing how much was at stake. Every conversation became a calculation. Every word mattered. There were moments, late at night, when exhaustion pressed down hard enough to blur the edges of my confidence. I stared at spreadsheets until the numbers swam, my body heavy with the kind of fatigue that seeps into your bones. Doubt tried to sneak in then, whispering that maybe this was too much. Maybe I had pushed too far. I thought of the dining room table, the laughter, the certainty in my brother's voice when he spoke about my future like it was already written. And something steady replaced the doubt. I didn't come this far to confirm their assumptions. The situation reached its breaking point faster than I expected. Deadlines tightened. Trust wavered. I felt the weight of people waiting on me, counting on decisions I hadn't yet made. This wasn't theoretical risk anymore. It was immediate, personal, real. I made the call that mattered most with my voice calm and my hands shaking just slightly out of view. I didn't oversell. I didn't beg. I laid out the reality as clearly as I could, knowing that credibility was the only leverage I had left. When the response came, it wasn't relief. It was permission to keep going. The crisis didn't resolve itself neatly. There was no clean victory, no triumphant turn. But it stabilized. Just enough. The structure held. The ground beneath me stopped crumbling long enough for me to breathe. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. I had survived something that could have ended everything. Not because I was lucky, because I stayed present when it mattered most. That survival changed something fundamental. The stakes were no longer abstract. I wasn't building in the shadows anymore. People were watching now, even if they didn't know my name yet. Attention had found me, whether I wanted it or not. With it came a new awareness. Silence was harder to maintain at this scale. Success leaves traces. It ripples outward, touching worlds you never intended to enter. The careful distance I had kept between my life and my family's world was narrowing. I saw it in the overlap of institutions, in names that appeared in places they hadn't before, in conversations that brushed against familiar territory without realizing it. Threads I hadn't pulled connecting quietly beneath the surface. I didn't react. Reaction would have revealed too much. Instead, I adjusted, strengthened what needed reinforcing. Prepared for scrutiny I could feel approaching like a storm on the horizon, the kind you don't outrun. You endure. When I finally left the office that night, The city was quiet in a way that made everything feel exposed. Streetlights hummed. The air was cold and clear. I stood there for a moment, hands in my pockets, letting the weight of what had almost happened settle fully. Almost losing everything had clarified something for me. I wasn't strong because I never struggled. I was strong because I didn't collapse when it mattered most. The version of me my family believed in wouldn't have survived this. The real one had. As I drove home, exhaustion wrapped around me, heavy but honest. I knew this chapter of my life had changed the trajectory of everything that followed. The danger hadn't scared me away. It had confirmed something deeper. I was exactly where I belonged. And somewhere not far from my own path, my brother was still standing at the peak of his confidence, unaware that the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he believed. I saw my brother again not long after that, at a gathering meant to celebrate him. Not officially, of course. It was framed as something casual, an excuse to get everyone together, but the reason sat at the center of the room wearing confidence like a tailored suit. He had done well. Everyone knew it. He moved through the house, shaking hands, accepting praise with practiced ease, already half bored by it. My father followed him with his eyes, pride written plainly across his face, as if my brother's success validated every decision he had ever made. I stayed near the edge of the room, a glass in my hand, listening. No one ignored me outright. They didn't have to. Attention flowed naturally toward him, like water finding the lowest point. He was comfortable there. He always had been. When he spoke about work, people leaned in. When he laughed, others joined. His stories were full of momentum, of wins stacked neatly on top of one another. There was no hesitation in him, no doubt. He spoke as someone who believed the future belonged to him by default. At one point, he glanced over at me, eyebrows lifting slightly in acknowledgement. "You still doing your thing?" he asked, tone light, almost indulgent. I nodded. "Busy," I said. He smiled, satisfied. "Good. Just don't get stuck, okay? It's easy to spin your wheels if you don't have the right structure." The advice landed smoothly, wrapped in concern, perfectly calibrated to sound generous. People nearby nodded, approving of his maturity. I smiled back, just as politely. What he didn't see was what sat beneath his certainty. As the afternoon wore on, I started to notice details I might have missed before. Names mentioned in passing, institutions referenced casually. The kind of information that means nothing if you're not listening for it. My brother spoke about a deal, about a partnership his firm was proud of, about how secure everything felt. Secure is a dangerous word. I felt it then, a quiet recognition settling into place. Not excitement, not satisfaction, understanding. His world and mine weren't separate after all. They ran parallel, close enough to touch without ever colliding. Close enough that a shift on one side would echo on the other. He didn't know. No one there did. I said nothing. Silence, at that moment, wasn't kindness. It wasn't protection. It was restraint. If I spoke, even hinted at what I knew, I would give him time to adjust, to prepare, to insulate himself. Awareness would become armor, so I let him feel invincible. My father clapped him on the shoulder as if sealing a deal. "You made the right choices," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "You stayed the course." There it was. The comparison without my name attached to it. The implication hung in the air, familiar and heavy, right and wrong, upward and stalled. Success and whatever it was they believed I represented. I felt no urge to correct them. People assume silence means submission. They misunderstand it. Silence, when chosen deliberately, is distance. It creates space where others grow careless. It lets confidence swell unchecked. I watched my brother bask in approval, unaware that his success rested partly on structures he didn't control, unaware that power doesn't always sit where people think it does. Sometimes it works quietly, behind the scenes, waiting. The family drew their conclusions quickly. They always did. He had won. I had chosen differently and paid for it. The narrative was clean and satisfying. It required no reevaluation, no discomfort. I wasn't angry, that surprised me. Years earlier, moments like this would have tightened something sharp in my chest. Now it felt distant, almost academic, like observing a system you finally understand. I wasn't plotting against him. That mattered to me. I wasn't interested in humiliation or revenge for its own sake. I didn't need to take anything from him to feel whole. I simply refused to keep shrinking to preserve his sense of superiority. The truth didn't belong to him, or to my parents. It belonged to me. As the evening wound down, my brother stood at the center of the room, surrounded by praise, by expectation, by certainty. He believed the world was aligned neatly beneath his feet. He believed he had already crossed the finish line. That belief was the most dangerous thing about him. I left quietly, as I usually did. No one noticed. No one needed to. Outside, the air was cool, grounding. I took a deep breath and felt something settle inside me. Power doesn't rush to announce itself. It doesn't need applause. It waits until the moment speaking becomes unnecessary. My brother thought he had already won. He thought the story was complete. He had no idea how close he was to the part that would change everything. The first sign that my careful balance was breaking came in the most unremarkable way. An email. No bold subject line, no dramatic language. Just a polite request for confirmation, written in the kind of tone that assumes cooperation because it rarely hears refusal. I read it twice before the weight of it settled in. It wasn't praise, it wasn't congratulations. It was verification, names, dates, numbers. Questions that didn't care about my comfort or my timing. Questions that existed to establish facts, not feelings. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the screen, feeling something unfamiliar rise in my chest. Not excitement, not pride, alarm. This wasn't an opportunity. It was exposure. For years, I had built my life around intentional invisibility. Quiet rooms, controlled conversations, a version of myself that could pass through family dinners without raising suspicion. And now, without warning, a publication that carried weight far beyond my control was looking directly at me. They weren't asking if I wanted to be seen. They were confirming that I already was. I closed the laptop and leaned back, pressing my fingers against my temples. My mind moved quickly, running through scenarios, calculating outcomes. Once something like this went public, there was no taking it back, no editing it down to something harmless. The story would exist whether I liked it or not, and everyone I had kept at a distance would suddenly feel entitled to it, including my family. What unsettled me most was the timing. The calendar on my phone sat open, reminders stacked neatly in a row. Christmas Eve circled in red. A family gathering I had already committed to. A room full of people who believed they knew exactly who I was. I felt a thin smile pull at my mouth. Of course. For a brief moment I considered declining, not responding, finding a way to stay hidden a little longer. But I knew better. Silence now would raise more questions than answers. Refusal would look evasive, defensive. It would invite scrutiny instead of delaying it. So I responded, carefully. I answered what I had to, and nothing more. I asked about timing, about process, about how much control I might have over the details. The answer was polite, professional, firm. There would be an embargo, they said, but not indefinitely. Accuracy mattered. Transparency mattered. The story was moving forward. I closed the email and exhaled slowly. The truth was already in motion. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid of being known, but because I understood what knowledge would do to the people who had underestimated me for so long. They wouldn't just be surprised. They would be destabilized. The version of reality they relied on would crack, and they would scramble to repair it in whatever way best served them. I wasn't sure I was ready for that. In the days that followed, I moved through my life with heightened awareness. Every conversation felt loaded. Every decision carried a new edge. I was no longer just managing my work. I was managing inevitability. I tried once more to limit the damage, to keep my name out of certain places, to soften language, to reduce personal details. I negotiated where I could, pushed back where it made sense. I won some ground, lost others. The truth, I realized, didn't need my permission anymore. What surprised me was how quickly my mindset shifted. At some point, I stopped trying to hide and started preparing for the questions, the reactions, the sudden interest from people who had never cared before. I thought about my brother, confident and certain, standing at the center of rooms like gravity bent in his direction. I thought about my parents, comfortable in their conclusions. I thought about the long years I had spent letting them believe I was behind, struggling, still figuring things out. They had built an image of me that suited them, one that made sense of their choices, one that didn't challenge their judgment. Soon, that image would no longer be sustainable. A confirmation came through late one evening. Final review. Publication scheduled. The date sat there on the screen, immovable. Christmas Eve. I laughed softly, alone in my apartment, the sound more tired than amused. Two worlds, perfectly aligned for collision. I didn't tell anyone. Not friends, not colleagues, certainly not family. I moved through the days that followed with deliberate calm, answering calls, attending meetings, finalizing details as if nothing unusual was happening. On the surface, everything was normal. Beneath it, a countdown ticked steadily forward. The night before the dinner, I stood by my window, city lights scattered below like constellations. I felt strangely steady. Whatever happened next, I wouldn't be caught unprepared. I had spent too long building something real to let fear dictate the ending. Recognition wasn't the goal. It never had been. Control was. Choice. The ability to decide who had access to me and who did not. I understood now that recognition was simply the cost of scale, and costs, once paid, don't get negotiated again. When I finally turned off the lights and went to bed, my mind was clear. The truth was coming, whether I invited it or not. All I could do was meet it with composure. I had spent years learning how to stay silent. Now, I was learning how to stand still while the world caught up. I arrived at my parents' house on Christmas Eve with the strange calm that comes when you already know the ending of a story everyone else thinks is still unfolding. The driveway was full. Lights wrapped the columns. Laughter drifted through the front door before I even stepped inside. Everything looked exactly the same. The house smelled like cinnamon and roasted meat, expensive candles burning as if scent alone could hold a family together. Coats were piled neatly by the door. Voices overlapped in the living room, familiar and confident. No one was tense, no one was worried. They had no reason to be. I did. I moved through the greetings easily, smiling, hugging where expected, accepting comments that slid past me without landing. My mother adjusted my sleeve and asked if I was warm enough. My father nodded, distracted, already halfway into a conversation about work. No one asked how I'd been lately. They never needed to. My brother arrived last, right on cue, filling the room without effort. He shook hands, accepted praise, laughed loudly enough to be heard over the music. Confidence followed him like a shadow. When he spotted me, he gave a quick nod, more acknowledgement than interest, before turning back to his audience. Dinner was announced, and we took our places around the long table, polished and glowing under the chandelier. The same seats, the same hierarchy. I took my place near the end, where I always did. Close enough to be included, far enough to be dismissed. Conversation flowed easily at first. Plans for the new year, vacations, houses, promotions. Every topic landed neatly in my brother's orbit. My father leaned toward him, pride open and unapologetic. My mother watched them both, pleased, relieved. Then the focus shifted. "So," my brother said, setting down his glass, glancing in my direction. "Still grinding away?" The word grinding drew a few smiles. Someone chuckled softly. "I guess," I said, keeping my tone even. He smiled wider. "You've always worked hard. Just never quite figured out how to turn it into anything, huh?" Laughter followed. Not loud, comfortable, familiar. My father added, "Effort's important, but direction matters more. You don't want to wake up one day and realize you've been busy without building anything. Heads nodded around the table. I cut into my food slowly, listening to the scrape of my knife against the plate. The words didn't surprise me. They rarely did. What struck me was how certain they sounded, how settled everyone felt in their conclusions. Someone else joined in, offering advice disguised as concern. Stability, security, long-term planning. The same phrases, recycled year after year. Each one pressed down a little harder, testing how much weight my silence could bear. I said nothing. Across from me, my brother leaned back, satisfied, as if he'd closed a case. He lifted his glass. "You'll get there someday," he said lightly. "Some people just take longer." I smiled faintly and raised my glass just enough to be polite. Under the table, my phone vibrated once. I ignored it. The conversation moved on, drifting back to safer ground. Wine was poured, plates were cleared, dessert appeared, rich and unnecessary. From the outside, it looked like a perfect family holiday. Warm, secure, certain of itself. Inside, time tightened. I became acutely aware of every small detail. The ticking clock on the wall. The glow of screens as phones were set beside plates. My brother's phone lay face up near his elbow, notifications lighting it briefly every few minutes before fading again. I felt no rush, no anxiety, just readiness. My brother was mid-story when it happened. He was talking about a deal, about how smoothly everything had gone, about how confident he felt heading into the new year. His phone buzzed, sharp and insistent, cutting through the room. He frowned slightly, annoyed at the interruption, then glanced down. His expression shifted just a fraction. Not fear, focus. "It's work," he said, already standing. "Excuse me." He answered without leaving the table, voice professional, relaxed. "Yes, Merry Christmas." At first, nothing seemed wrong. He nodded as he listened, offering brief responses. Then his posture changed, shoulders tightening. Smile fading. His eyes flicked up, scanning the room before landing on me. "Yes," he said slowly, "my sister." The room went quiet. Forks paused mid-air. My mother looked up sharply. My father leaned forward. "I see," my brother continued, his voice more careful now. "Yes, I understand." He ended the call and set the phone down with deliberate precision. For a moment, no one spoke. "What was that?" my father asked. My brother swallowed. His confidence hadn't vanished, but it had cracked. "It was complicated." My mother's gaze moved from him to me, uncertainty creeping in. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed on the table, jaw tight, as if recalibrating. "Apparently," he said finally, "there's some overlap." "Overlap with what?" my father pressed. My brother looked at me again. This time there was no dismissal in his eyes, only confusion edged with something sharper. With her. Every face at the table turned toward me. I set my fork down gently and met his gaze without speaking. Silence spread, thick and heavy, filling the space where laughter had been moments before. The certainty they'd worn so comfortably all evening began to waver. I didn't explain. I didn't clarify. I didn't rush to fill the gap. The phone on the table buzzed again, and this time, no one laughed. They were still waiting for answers. What they didn't realize was that the real question had already been asked. My brother's phone buzzed again, louder this time, vibrating against the polished wood as if it were impatient. He glanced at it, then at my father, then back at the screen. The confidence he'd worn all evening didn't disappear, but it tightened, pulled inward like fabric stretched too far. "I need to take this," he said, already lifting the phone. His tone was still controlled, still professional, but something underneath it had shifted. He stepped a few feet away from the table, though not far enough to escape the room. None of us went back to our food. Every movement slowed, attention drawn to him whether he wanted it or not. "Yes," he said. "I understand." "Of course." He listened for a moment, nodding, his free hand pressed flat against the back of a chair. His eyes flicked toward me again, sharper now, searching. Whatever he was hearing wasn't aligning with the story he'd been telling himself. "Yes," he repeated more carefully. "Her." My mother's fingers tightened around her napkin. My father leaned forward, his authority restless, unused to being excluded from information. My brother turned slightly, lowering his voice, but not enough. "No, I wasn't aware of that," he said. "That changes things." The word changes hung in the air like smoke. He ended the call abruptly and stood there for a beat, phone still in his hand, as if he were recalculating the room. When he returned to the table, he didn't sit down right away. He looked at my father, then at me, then back again. "What was that about?" my father asked, impatience creeping into his voice. My brother hesitated. The pause was small, but it was the first time I'd ever seen him hesitate in front of them. "It's about a decision that's being reviewed," he said. "Something tied to a larger restructuring." "And what does that have to do with her?" my father demanded, nodding toward me. My brother swallowed. "Apparently," he said slowly, "she's involved." The room stilled completely. My mother let out a soft, confused laugh, as if she'd misheard. "That doesn't make sense," she said. "Involved how?" My brother didn't answer her. He was looking at me now directly, his earlier dismissal replaced by something closer to disbelief. "Is this true?" he asked. "Do you have any idea what they're talking about?" Every face turned toward me again, expectant, uneasy, waiting for me to either laugh it off or finally admit to something small and harmless. I didn't rush. I folded my napkin and set it neatly beside my plate. The movement was deliberate, unhurried. I met my brother's gaze and held it, letting the silence do what it was always meant to do. "Yes," I said. One word, nothing more. My father's brow furrowed. "Yes to what?" "Yes," I repeated, calm. "I know what they're talking about." The shift in the room was immediate. My mother's hand flew to her chest. My father straightened, his posture bristling with authority that suddenly had no clear target. "You want to explain?" he said. I didn't answer him right away, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't need to. The truth didn't require a speech. It had already arrived without my help. My brother's phone buzzed again. This time, he didn't pick it up immediately. He stared at the screen as if it might rewrite itself. "What does this mean?" he asked finally, his voice lower now. "They mentioned Forbes." That was enough. My mother gasped softly. "Forbes?" My father laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "Don't be ridiculous." I looked at them, really looked at them, taking in the confusion, the resistance, the sudden cracks forming in their certainty. "They're not reporting on me to flatter me," I said. "They're reporting because it's relevant." Silence pressed down harder than before. My brother sat slowly, as if his legs had decided for him. "They said something about ownership," he murmured. "About influence." I nodded. "Yes." Nothing about the way I said it invited argument. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. The words he was used to relying on weren't lining up properly. My mother shook her head, eyes darting between us. "Why wouldn't you tell us?" she whispered. I didn't answer her. That question belonged to a different conversation, one we hadn't earned yet. My brother looked like he was piecing together fragments of a puzzle he'd never known existed. "This affects my firm," he said quietly. "Do you understand that?" "I do," I replied. "I've understood it for some time." The implications settled slowly, inexorably. Whatever confidence he'd built tonight, whatever certainty he'd worn so comfortably, was no longer his alone. It rested on ground he hadn't known I occupied. Someone at the table reached for their phone, scrolling, searching. A sharp intake of breath followed. "It's real," they said, barely audible. "It's everywhere." My father's face drained of color. My mother stared at me as if seeing a stranger. My brother said nothing at all. The laughter from earlier felt like it belonged to another lifetime. "I didn't ask for this moment," I said, my voice steady in the quiet. but I'm not going to pretend it isn't happening. No one interrupted me. No one could. For years they had spoken about me as if I were unfinished, unproven, still waiting for direction. Now, the truth sat between us, heavy and undeniable, and none of their old words fit anymore. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't defended myself. I hadn't needed to. The power shift was complete. Around the table, plates sat untouched, dessert cooling, celebration forgotten. My brother stared at his hands. My parents looked at each other, searching for a version of this that made sense. There wasn't one. Truth doesn't arrive gently. It arrives and waits for you to catch up. And in that waiting, everything changes. No one spoke for a long moment. The room that had been so loud only minutes earlier now felt hollow, like the sound had been pulled out of it and sealed away. Plates sat untouched. Glasses stood half full. Even the chandelier seemed too bright for what was happening beneath it. My father was the first to move. He cleared his throat, straightened in his chair, and tried to gather the authority that had always worked for him before. "Well," he said carefully, "this is unexpected." Unexpected. Not wrong, not unfair, just inconvenient. He leaned forward, hands folded, voice smoothing into something measured. "If this is all accurate, then clearly you've done very well. We always knew you were capable. Perhaps we didn't realize how far you'd come." I watched him closely as he spoke. The words were familiar, but the tone was new. This wasn't pride, it was adjustment. My mother nodded quickly, as if relieved to have something to agree with. "Yes," she said. "You should have told us. We could have supported you. We worried for nothing." Worried, as if the years of dismissal could be reframed as concern. My brother remained silent, staring at the table. The man who had filled every room with confidence now looked smaller, contained within himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight. "So you just let us believe you were struggling?" I met his eyes calmly. "You believed what you wanted to believe." "That's not fair," he said, frustration creeping in. "You let Mom worry. You let Dad think. I let you all treat me the way you always did," I interrupted quietly. "I didn't change anything." The words landed harder than I'd intended. My mother flinched. She reached for my hand, her fingers trembling slightly. "We didn't mean to hurt you," she said softly. "Families make mistakes. This doesn't have to change anything." There it was. The appeal to unity, to shared history, to moving forward without accountability. I withdrew my hand gently. "It already has changed," my father frowned. "What does that mean?" Before I could answer, my uncle spoke up from farther down the table, his tone casual in a way that felt deliberate. "If all this is true," he said, "there may be opportunities for collaboration. Keeping things in the family makes sense, doesn't it?" The room shifted again. I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was the moment I'd anticipated long before it arrived. Not the shock, not the silence, this. They didn't want to understand me. They wanted access. I straightened in my chair. "I built what I built on my own," I said evenly. "Without help. Without connections. Without protection. I'm not interested in merging that with people who couldn't see its value when it was still fragile." My father's expression hardened. "You're being emotional." I shook my head. "I'm being clear." My brother finally looked up. "So that's it?" he asked. "You just cut us out?" "I didn't cut anyone out," I replied. "You were never in." The words settled slowly, like dust after something heavy hits the ground. My mother's eyes filled with tears. "We're your family," she whispered. "Doesn't that count for anything?" I softened then, just a little. "It does," I said. "But family isn't supposed to disappear when you're uncertain and reappear when you're successful." No one argued with that. They looked confused, as if trying to understand why this didn't feel like a victory they could share. They still thought this was about punishment, about pride, about revenge. They were wrong. I didn't do any of this to prove you wrong, I continued. I did it because I needed to live a life that wasn't constantly being evaluated. I needed respect when I had nothing, not praise now that I have something. My brother's jaw tightened. You could have said something, he muttered. I did, I said quietly. Years ago. You laughed. That ended the conversation more effectively than anything else I could have said. The room fell into a different kind of silence. Not shock, not disbelief, recognition, slow and uncomfortable. My father looked older suddenly. My mother looked tired. My brother looked lost, stripped of the certainty that had always anchored him. I felt no satisfaction in it, only distance. I stood and gathered my things, movements unhurried. No one stopped me this time. As I reached the doorway, my father spoke again, his voice lower. We can figure this out, he said. There's no reason for this to become a divide. I turned back once, meeting his gaze. The divide was already there, I said. I just stopped pretending it wasn't. I left the room behind me, the sound of my footsteps steady against the floor. I didn't wait for anyone to follow. I didn't look back to see if they were watching. For the first time in my life, I wasn't measured by their expectations or shaped by their disappointment. I wasn't part of their hierarchy anymore. And as I stepped into the quiet of the hallway, I knew with absolute certainty that I had finally taken my place outside the story they had written for me. I stepped out into the cold night and let the door close behind me without rushing it. The sound was soft, almost polite, but it felt final. Inside, voices had already begun to rise again, searching for footing, for explanations, for a version of events they could live with. I didn't wait to hear them. The air outside was sharp and clean, the kind that clears your head whether you ask it to or not. I took a slow breath and felt my shoulders drop for the first time all evening. The tension I'd carried for years loosened, as if it had finally been given permission to leave. For so long, I'd imagined what this moment would feel like. I thought it might be loud. I thought it might be triumphant. I thought there might be satisfaction in watching them scramble to understand what they'd missed. But standing there alone, coat pulled tight against the cold, what I felt most was quiet. Not emptiness, not relief exactly, peace. I walked down the driveway past cars I recognized, past lights glowing warmly in windows that no longer felt like home. With each step, the weight of expectation lifted. I hadn't realized how heavy it had been until it was gone. Success didn't give me revenge, it gave me choice. I hadn't needed to raise my voice at that table. I hadn't needed to list achievements or defend decisions. The truth had spoken for itself, and once it did, everything else became unnecessary. I didn't need apologies that came too late or pride that only surfaced when it was convenient. What I needed, I already had. In the car, the silence wrapped around me gently instead of pressing in. Streetlights blurred past as I drove, familiar roads suddenly feeling distant, like routes I no longer needed to memorize. I thought about how much of my life I'd spent trying to earn something that was never freely given. Respect isn't a reward, it's a baseline. For years, I had mistaken endurance for strength. I believed surviving their doubt meant I was doing something right. What I learned instead was that strength isn't measured by how much you can tolerate. It's measured by how clearly you can draw a line and walk away without needing permission. I didn't hate them. That surprised me too. Anger had burned itself out long ago, replaced by understanding. They weren't villains. They were people who needed the world to stay simple, ordered, predictable. I had complicated that just by existing outside their expectations. That was never my burden to carry. When I reached my apartment, the building was quiet, the hallway dimly lit. I unlocked my door and stepped inside, setting my keys down, hanging up my coat. The space felt exactly right. Unimpressive to anyone else. Perfect to me. I sat by the window for a while, city lights flickering below, and let my thoughts settle. This wasn't an ending. It was a closing chapter, the kind you finish before turning the page, knowing the story continues, just without the old cast. I didn't need their approval to move forward. I didn't need their pride to validate what I'd built. And I didn't need their understanding to know who I was. I had already proven the only thing that mattered to me, that I could choose myself without burning everything behind me, that I could walk away without bitterness, that I could succeed without becoming what they expected or feared. If you're listening to this and parts of it feel familiar, you're not alone. Many of us grow up inside stories written for us by people who believe they know what's best. Stories where love comes with conditions and approval depends on obedience. Walking away from that doesn't make you ungrateful, it makes you honest. So I'll leave you with this. If the people closest to you decided who you were before you ever had the chance to find out for yourself, what would you do when you finally proved them wrong? Would you rush back for validation? Would you let them rewrite the past to protect their pride? Or would you do what I did and let your life speak quietly, clearly, and without apology? If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments. And if you want to stay with me for more real stories about boundaries, self-respect, and finding your power without losing yourself, make sure you're subscribed. Some stories don't end with shouting or slammed doors. Some end with peace. And those are the ones worth staying for.